Hello, my name is Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. During recent trips to the Caribbean, the British royal family has faced demands for reparations and compensation for the UK's involvement in the slave trade. What are reparations? And should we pay reparations for slavery? Let's talk about this on today's episode of Thinking in English. You can find the full transcript on thinkinginenglish.blog. Head over to the Thinking in English podcast on Instagram for some more great content. And leave a like and follow wherever you're listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Head of state. Head of state. The official leader of a country, often someone who has few or no real power. For example, Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state in 15 countries. Atrocity. Atrocity. An extremely cruel, violent, or shocking act. For example, they are currently investigating the atrocities committed during the war. To trace. To trace. To discover the causes or origins of something by examining the way in which it has developed. Such as, she traced her family back 400 years. Impoverished. Impoverished. Very poor. Such as, he was an impoverished young actor. Wrongdoing. Wrongdoing. A bad or an illegal action. For example, she has denied any wrongdoing. Descendant. Descendant. A person who is related to you and who lives after you. For instance, they claim to be the descendants of the royal family. To emancipate. To emancipate. To free a person from another person's control. As in, slaves in the British Empire were mostly emancipated in 1833. Appalling. Appalling. Very bad. For example, the weather today is appalling. Precedent. Precedent. Precedent is an action, situation, or decision that has already happened and can be used as a reason why a similar action or decision should be performed or made. For example, there is already precedent for promoting people with no formal qualifications in this company. When people think of Queen Elizabeth II, they tend to associate her with the UK. She is head of state in the UK. She has lived in the country for her whole life, and her face is on our money and postage stamps. But did you know that she is not just Queen of England? In fact, Queen Elizabeth is the head of state and queen in 15 countries, including the UK. For example, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Belize, Jamaica, Bahamas, St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines all still have Queen Elizabeth as the head of state. While these countries are now all completely independent and sovereign, The role of the Queen, the royal family, and the UK can be quite controversial. In many of these countries, Britain and the British government committed atrocities, established slave societies, and created colonies based on racism. Take the Caribbean islands for an example. Today, significant amounts of the Caribbean can trace their ancestry back to slaves and laborers brought to work on the islands by the Europeans. Most famously, millions of African slaves were brought by the British, French, and Dutch to grow things like sugar and spices. Irish, Indians, Chinese, and Indonesian people were also used as forced labor. Queen Elizabeth is head of state in countries largely made up of descendants of the slaves that helped to turn the UK into the world's most powerful country in the 19th century. Yet, many of these countries remain poor and impoverished, despite the riches they created for the European empires. As a result, there have been increasing calls for these islands to become republics and distance themselves from the Queen. If you have been listening to Thinking in English for a while, you might remember the episode I recorded on Barbados last year. They became a republic and said goodbye to the Queen in 2021. However, simply becoming a republic and getting rid of the Queen, is that enough to recover from Britain's and Europe's history of exploitation? Over the past few months, members of the British royal family have taken part in overseas trips and tours to represent the Queen in the Caribbean. Rather than a joyous welcome, the Queen's grandson and future British King, Prince William, and his wife Kate, were greeted with protests and demonstrations when they visited Jamaica and the Bahamas in March. Groups were demanding that Britain both apologize for historical wrongdoings and pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. In fact, the Jamaican government already announced plans last year to demand compensation from the British government for enslaving over 600,000 Africans who were then taken to Jamaica. One politician in Jamaica proposed that the UK should pay $10 billion. Jamaica is also making efforts to become a republic like Barbados. Prince William and Kate were not the only royals to face protests in the Caribbean. The Queen's son, Prince Edward, was also confronted with protesters in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who were also calling for slave trade reparations. Prince Edward even had to cancel his planned trip to Grenada when the Grenada government announced he would be forced to meet with the country's Reparations Commission on Slavery. Across Britain's former slave colonies, demands are now growing for compensation. Slavery made the UK and the British royal family incredibly wealthy, but left the former slave colonies impoverished. A quote from one of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines protesters sums up the sentiment nicely. Jomo Thomas said to The Guardian that they hunted us down, they kidnapped us, they stole us, they worked us, they owe us, and now they must pay us. Protests across the Caribbean are calling for reparations from the British government. But what are reparations? In simple terms, reparations are payments, which could be money or something with value, given to a group that has suffered harm. They are a form of compensation for past wrongdoings. Perhaps the most famous example of reparations came after World War I. Germany didn't just lose the First World War, they were forced to pay for the entire thing. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay 132 billion gold marks, about 270 billion US dollars today, to the countries damaged and affected by the conflict. This massive debt is one of the factors that contributed to the rise of Hitler's Nazi Party in the 1930s. And Germany only finished paying its World War I reparations in 2010, I think. Reparations for slavery would be based on the idea that slaves were brought from Africa and other parts of the world to the Americas, forced to work, helped make European countries unimaginably wealthy, and their descendants are still suffering and impoverished as a result. An interesting fact is that the UK actually already paid reparations for slavery in the 19th century, but not to the slaves. The Slave Compensation Act of 1837 was passed by the British Parliament after slavery was banned in the Empire. However, the compensation did not go to former slaves, but the slave owners. 40,000 slave owners were awarded a share of £20 million, which today is worth around £2.5 billion. So that was paid to slave owners in reparations. And the British government was actually still paying this debt in 2015. Reparations do not necessarily have to just be money. Reparations could also include a wide variety of different measures. For example, in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights 2021 annual reports, examples of non-monetary reparations included apologies, education, memorials, reforming institutions, and making sure that the historical wrongdoings will never be repeated. Britain is not the only country facing demands to pay compensation to former slaves. The United States famously allowed slavery until the middle of the 19th century, and many social problems in the US were caused by slavery in the past. France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and other European colonial powers also benefited immensely from slavery. So, should the British, American, French, Portuguese, or other former slave trading countries pay reparations to the descendants of slaves? Although it's clear slavery was a terrible atrocity, paying reparations is a controversial and difficult topic. I'm now going to highlight arguments from both sides of the debate. As I always do with these debate style episodes, I'll give you some of the common arguments and then ask you to think critically about the issue. After listening to the episode, you can decide yourself whether countries like Britain should pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. And remember to think in English. So let's start with reasons why governments should pay reparations for slavery. First, slavery created massive wealth for some countries and individuals, but left millions of people across the Americas impoverished. Let's take the United States as an example. According to the Atlantic correspondent Ta-Nehisi Coates, by 1836, more than 600 million US dollars, almost half of all of the economic activity in the United States, derived directly or indirectly from cotton produced by the millions of slaves. By the time the slaves were emancipated, they comprised the largest single asset in America, $3 billion in 1860 dollars, more than all of the other assets in the country combined. The situation was the same across the former European slave colonies in the Caribbean. But as slavery was gradually banned and discontinued, this wealth was never available to the former slaves or their descendants. As I mentioned earlier, countries like the UK actually used their wealth to compensate former slave owners instead of former slaves. And even after slavery, racism and discrimination continued and prevented the descendants of slaves from accessing wealth. Slaves were not simply forced to work for free, they were treated terribly and faced appalling conditions. New diseases were introduced to African populations. The journey across the ocean was infamous for the atrocious treatment of slaves. Slaves were regularly forced to work in dangerous conditions, and even after slavery, were prevented from accessing healthcare. Reparations would go some way to address the historical mistreatment and help improve the health conditions of slaves' modern day descendants. There is also already precedent for paying reparations to former slaves and other groups who have been harmed. The US government has already paid reparations to Japanese Americans imprisoned during World War II and the victims of the Tuskegee study. Like the UK, parts of the US actually paid slave owners compensation in the past as well. Some organizations have already begun to offer compensation to the descendants of the slaves that were formerly owned by those organizations. Universities, including Georgetown, Virginia Theological Seminary, and Princeton Theological Seminary, are currently paying such reparations. German manufacturing companies like Siemens and Volkswagen have also created funds to pay reparations to the former slaves forced to work for them during World War II. On the other hand, there are also a lot of people who think governments should not pay reparations for slavery. The slave trade was banned by the UK at the beginning of the 19th century, and slavery was abolished in most of the empire by 1833. This means that there are no living former slaves and no living person who has owned a slave. We would need to look far back in our histories to find a person who was even alive during the period of slavery, let alone owned a slave themselves. Should we be punished or held accountable for something that people alive today had no involvement in or influence over? A lot of progress has been made since the time of slavery. Laws have been passed to make sure such things can't happen again, and international organizations have been set up to improve human rights. Is this enough? Governments would probably use taxpayer money to pay reparations to slaves. Most people would agree that slavery was a terrible thing, but should people today be punished for the crimes of their ancestors? Reparations are also not a simple thing. How can you put a price on centuries of pain, damage, and trauma? How much should the descendants of slaves be paid? Paying reparations may actually cause even more divides in countries across the world. Depending on your ancestry, you could either be paying or receiving reparations, or maybe even both, despite being citizens of the same country. Many descendants of slaves would be insulted by the amount of money offered as compensation. Considering the incredible number of descendants, it would be impossible to offer a lot. And people across Europe, white Americans, and even some Caribbean islanders would be angered that they need to pay, probably through taxes, for something they didn't do. Reparations are intended for the victims of slavery, but there are no direct victims of slavery around in the Caribbean or the Americas today. Of course, Indirect slavery has caused problems, but these problems could be addressed in different ways. Reparations would also be too expensive and too difficult to pay. I mentioned that Jamaica has considered asking the UK to pay $10 billion in compensation. But can you imagine the cost of compensating every single descendant of every single slave? In the US alone, there are around 30 million descendants. Some estimates suggest that the US would need to pay out trillions of dollars, almost half of all of the money it has. Some estimates even say more money than the US has, half of the US's national debt. Also, who should receive reparations? Slavery ended over 100 years ago, and since that period, there has been a great deal of migration and cultural mixing. Should incredibly wealthy descendants of former slaves receive compensation? Or should it just be the poorer descendants? What if you have ancestors who were slaves and other ancestors who benefited from slavery? How can we accurately trace family histories when there were not good records kept for slaves in the past? And if the descendants of slaves receive reparations, should the indigenous peoples and other forced laborers also be compensated? Basically, reparations are incredibly expensive and probably impossible to pay to individuals. So here is today's final thought. As the British royal family visited countries in the Caribbean, they were met with protests and demonstrations demanding reparations for slavery. Similar demands can be regularly found in the African American community of the US. This episode of Thinking in English has tried to explain the idea of reparations and provide you with some arguments both in support and against paying reparations for slavery. On the one side, slavery created massive wealth inequality. Countries like the UK and US became rich off the backs of slave labor, while the former slave colonies have been left impoverished. There is also precedent to pay reparations to former slaves. On the other hand, should people today be held responsible for the actions of their ancestors? Slavery was terrible, but no one alive today was involved in such an atrocity. Who should receive reparations? How much should they receive? Reparations would probably be very expensive and very difficult to implement. So, what do you think? Should governments and countries like the UK and the US or France or the Netherlands or Spain pay reparations for slavery? Should they pay money or are there other ways to apologize? Do you think paying reparations would improve relations between Britain and its former colonies or improve relations within the United States? Let me know in the comments on Spotify or reach out to me on Instagram or answer in the comments on the blog. As always, you can find a full transcript on thinkinginenglish.blog. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for lots of content and things, and personal pictures of myself playing board games. And leave a like, a follow, subscribe wherever you are. Leave a rating on Spotify if you'd like, rating on Apple as well. And if you'd like to donate to Thinking in English, you can do. There's a link in the description, or you can go to my blog. I hope everyone has a great day. See you next time.